The class, in the last class what we were talking about was we have started with the group called as Algae. When we are talking about classification of plants, we know the primitive group is called as Algae, and as evolution continues we will have to talk about the modern group, that is Angiosperms. Talking about Algae, some of the general features of Algae as far as reproduction is concerned, habitat is concerned, forms of Algae, etc., etc. This is something that we have already done, right? We were talking about classification of Algae, and we know Algae has been classified on the basis of many features and primarily on the basis of pigments, and according to the pigments they are classified under three headings, that is green algae, brown algae and red algae. So, in the last class we have almost completed green algae, features bilak ami already kolo, but today we have to talk about brown algae and red algae. But before discussing that, duta example of green algae okoman points janibo lagibo. For example, we have to know certain points about Chlamydomonas and certain points about Spirogyra. ঠিক আছে, সেই দুটাৰ অকণ পইণ্ট জানিম। আগতে লাইফ চাইকেল লাগিছিলে, কিন্তু আজিকালি লাইফ চাইকেল নালাগে। সো উইল জাষ্ট নো চাৰ্টেন পইণ্টছ। সো হেডিং কৰিবা Chlamydomonas। Certain points about Chlamydomonas. Picture clear aha nai? Okay, okol tumar ne baki students are clear aha nai? What about the rest of the students? Okol tumar clear aha nai no? Thik ase okoman deri swa. Etia kuntu statement tumak lage moi dictate kori dium. Koa? Kuntu statement dhoribo par nai? हाँ इटे क्लियर होइसे ठीक আছে Diagram not very important, diagram of questions teneke ahao nai. তাৰপিছত লিখা reproduction ইয়াতে কিবা words বুজি পোৱা নাই নি পাইছো না আইসোকন্ট হেটেৰোকন্ট আমি বহুত বাৰ কৈছো Students, can you see the board? Online students, dekha pai asa no? Out of all the informations that we have written about Chlamydomonas, all the points are not very important. From examination point of view, questions kihor upor ahe, identify the example of a green algae, that might be a question. Second, example of a motile unicellular green algae, because we know there is non-motile also, right? Unicellular green algae. Then next could be cup shaped chloroplast. The question might come against that. The cup shaped chloroplast thaka eta example kwa. Next is the function of a pyrenoid. In the last class we have already talked about pyrenoid proteins thakibo. Apart from proteins, it also contains starch. What is a pyrenoid? It's nothing but a storage organelle inside the cell, right? And something about the cell wall we have written, no, the true cellulose na thake, right? Generally ki hoy, it is obviously an example of algae. So algae is a plant, so plant cell or ki thakibo lagisile, cellulose thakibo lagisile. But since we are talking about evolution, no, it is gradually evolved. I mean, it's gradually showing evolution. So kisuman characteristics previous but primitive groups logoto share koribo. For example, bacteria jeneke ami glycoproteins we have talked about, no, certain characteristics would be common in Chlamydomonas also. True cellulose gradually with evolution hami plant cell bilako dekha pao. Right. So, if you talk about Spirogyra, obviously it will have true cellulose, but if you are talking about Chlamydomonas, true cellulose na thake. Instead of that, ki thake we have already written. Right. Just remember the word glycoprotein. Okol hetu mone thakile hobo. So, ekhini asile information about Chlamydomonas. Next, yes, please say. Last line to one. Last line of likha aplanospores or hypnospores are also seen. Certain types of spores formed during unfavorable conditions. Aplanospores, A-P-L-A-N-O-S-P-O-R-E-S, and hypnospores. Okay. Spirogyra mein informations likho. Examination point of view pra ki important will be just marking those. some of the points that we have written, what is important, also called. ठीक है? Next, what is important is fresh water. কি থাকিব? Mucilage, filament, all the cells are similar, right? Next, what they will have? Spirally coiled chloroplast. I think you all remember, no? Cup shaped chloroplast, spirally coiled, reticulate, etc. Spirally coiled. Next is obviously pyrenoids. Why pyrenoids? Because the storage organ we have already discussed. What is so important about this is it contains many pyrenoids. There are certain cells which has just one pyrenoid. For example, if you are talking about Chlamydomonas, tato pyrenoid thake, kintu keita thake matro eta, right? That is one green algae that has a single pyrenoid, but this is another green algae that has a number of pyrenoids in a linear way, right? So if these are chloroplasts, chloroplast ki thakibo? Storage organs থাকিব, storage organ to আমি কি বুলি কম? Pyrenoid. এটা থাকিব নে বেছিকে থাকিব? বেছিকে থাকিব, right? Next is the question has been asked about this number also, right? এটা cellot কেইটা chloroplast থাকে? It is almost 1 to 16. আৰু তাতকে যদি if suppose the examiner wants to ask more precisely, you have to remember this also, right? Left handed. A spiral to say hoise eneke ahise eneke ahise, it's left handed, right? Generally this point is not very important, but this one is important, right? So, যোনকেইটা point mark কৰি দিছে তোমালোকেও mark কৰি লোৱা। So, talking about reproduction, what is the type of reproduction that we are going to see in this type of algae? কেনেকুৱা ধৰণৰ reproduction দেখা পাম? Reproduction বুলি ক'লে কি হয়? Asexual আৰু sexual to হয় ন? Types of asexual, types of sexual. So if you are talking about a form like this, so তাহাঁতৰ কেনেকুৱা ধৰণৰ reproduction দেখা পাম? Algae কেনেকুৱা ধৰণে reproduce কৰে? All the three types of reproduction are seen in algae. So in Spirogyra also, to be precise, vegetative reproduction, sexual reproduction, বা asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction দুইটাই দেখা পাম, right? If you are talking about vegetative reproduction, we have talked about two types of vegetative reproduction that's very common. Right? One was binary fission and the other was fragmentation. So, ihotor bilakok, these are also called as key forms, filamentous forms. So, if they are filamentous forms, it has a reproduction most commonly keneke hobo? Fragmentation, right? Okay, so asexual reproduction generally absent, but when they are put in a sugar solution, then we can see certain types of spore formation, that is a parthenospore, or which is also called as the azygospore. Parthenospore is one type of a spore, that's okay. Hypnospore, aplanospore, parthenospore, these are certain types of spores seen in case of algae. As far as azygospore is concerned, this is something that we have already discussed. A zoospore without a flagella, right? Without a flagella. So, কেতিয়াবা কি হয় জুস্পোৰটো ফ্ল্যাজেলাটো উইথড্ৰ কৰি দিয়ে ন তেতিয়াহলে তাক আমি কি বুলি কম এট দ্যাট টাইম ইটস কল্ড এজ আ আজাইগোস্পোৰ Next is sexual reproduction heading koriba sexual reproduction especially questions regarding sexual reproduction e ahe Talking about sexual reproduction, especially এই দুটা word আমি জানিব লাগে ডিটেইলছত নহয় কিন্তু অকমান বস্তু জানিব লাগে we'll just understand, we don't have to write the note entirely, right? So a question আহিব পাৰে scalariform conjugation or lateral conjugation is a characteristic of, or the question could be Spirogyra reproduces sexually by, right? Spirogyra reproduces sexually by either of these two methods, and out of these two methods which one is common, which one is primitive, we have already known. Now coming to this, since we are talking about what sexual reproduction, তেতিয়াহ'লে sexual reproduction ত কি থাকিব লাগিব, gamete form কৰিব লাগিব, right? So what happens in scalariform and what happens in lateral? One basic difference between scalariform conjugation and lateral conjugation. So conjugation মানে কি, mixing, right? Two cells will mix or fuse together, that is what is called as conjugation, right? So scalariform conjugation and lateral conjugation are different key if only one filament is involved, that is what is called as lateral. If two filaments are involved in the process of sexual reproduction, that is called as scalariform. Do you know the meaning of scalariform? Did is scalariform meaning to jana, তেতিয়াহ'লে we'll have an idea about the process. Scalariform মানে কেনেকুৱা, it's scalariform or meaning to কি, ladder like, ladder চিনি পাও ন, জখলা. So that is what is called as scalariform. What happens during conjugation or scalariform is we are talking about one filament, we are talking about another filament, right? So filamentous যেহেতু obviously cells থাকিব, তো ইয়াতো দুডাল cells থাকিব, right? So two filaments are involved. What happens is during the process of sexual reproduction, any cell of the filament might act like a gamete. It is not a higher plant where you will see proper well-formed gametes inside a sex organ. Teneke ami dekha na pao. Because these are very primitive forms and lower organisms, right? So they will undergo sexual reproduction, so they have to form gametes who kabar audio to okkoman disturb kori ase. Okay, please mute it. Kar audio? Okay, thank you. So what I was saying is, since we are talking about sexual reproduction, so we have to talk about the formation of gametes. But as we said, no, proper gamete formation ami dekha na pao. What we know here is during the process of reproduction, any cell of the filament might act as a gamete, right? Jeneke higher plants or ki hoy, you have the sex organs, inside the sex organs you see the proper gametes. Male sex organ or bitor ami ki dekha pao, the male gamete, and female sex organ, inside the female sex organ we see the female gamete. But in these lower forms, specific sexual ba sex organs bilak ami iman bhalke dekha na pao. So in case of these, during the process any cell of the filament might act as a gamete. For example, if you are talking about this, no, process of ki hobo, they will round off. Obviously it was a cell thake tat to tar nijor respective nucleus bilak thakiboi, no? So I am not drawing the entire thing. What will happen, they will round off, then they have to fuse with the other filament, ya to simultaneously a cell to round off koribo. And what they will do is they will form a conjugating tube, right? So ultimately what happens, this one moves through this one and ultimately forms the zygote. Sexual reproduction of thakile, huh? What happened? বন্ধ হৈ গ'ল, আমাক কৈ দিয়া কাট বন্ধ। এনেকৈ ক্লাছবোৰ পিছুৱাই পিছুৱাই যাতকৈ দেৰি হৈ গৈ থাকে। Students, can you see the board and hear me? wait. Since I am waiting, you have to wait. In the meantime, ki likhim baru kiba ta likhi diu. Yeah, you can hear me, right? Ekin likhi lua. শুনা পাইছানে? নাই শুনা? নাই শেষ। আৰু লিখিবলৈ একোৱেই নাই, তেনে ৰৈ থাকা আৰু যি লিখিব আছে লিখি ল'ব, কাৰণ ডিটেইলছ নালাগে, ঠিক আছে, খালি ৱৰ্ডকেইটা লাগে আৰু জানিব লাগে বাছ। Hello students, শুনা পাইছানে? Okay. Okay, then we'll continue. So what I was saying was, I was discussing the sexual reproduction. In this case, especially when we are talking about scalariform, what we understand, any cell of the filament might act as a gamete. Any gamete or any cell will move to the other filament and ultimately they will form the zygote. As far as the zygote formation is concerned, since two filaments are involved, no, zygote to coat form koribo. The zygote could be formed here, or it could be formed here, or sometimes it could be formed in the middle portion also, right? If suppose A2 yale gusi jai, if this contents move to this cell, then obviously the zygote would be formed here. If suppose this moves to here, then obviously the zygote would be formed here. So zygote coat form koribo depending on kuntu filament ole move korise, and sometimes inside or in the middle part also, right? Next, as far as sexual reproduction is concerned, since we have to talk about gametes, we have to talk about male gamete and female gamete also. But looking at this diagram, kuntuk male kom, kuntuk female kom, we have no idea, right? Because male gamete boli kowa log lage, it has to have certain specific characteristics, and similarly female gamete should have certain similar characteristics, right? But since these are lower forms, we cannot be talking it as such as, we cannot be considering this as male Spirogyra and this as female Spirogyra. Male and female are not the words that we use in case of lower organisms. Male or female word to use koribo lagile, they should have proper morphological features, right? Morphological differences thakibo lagibo, ami dekhile gom pabo lagibo, tetia ha ami male word to ba female word to ami use koribo paru. So both of them look exactly the same, so you cannot be using the word male and female, so instead you cannot be using the word male gamete and female gamete. But we know male gamete or female gamete to lagibo sexual reproduction o karone, right? So which one would be considered as male and which one would be considered as female is the one that will move, that is always considered as male. The one that receives and fuses, that is considered as female. If suppose this one goes here, etu kami ki boli dhori male gamete, etu ki boli dhori female gamete. Next again, so eta type of start ho gol. Next again, suppose this cell wants to, or this cell, this time what happens, this cell converts itself into a gamete and this also converts into a gamete. Tetia ki hobo, they will form another tube and then the movement will go on. Since ultimately this structure looks like a leather, so it's called as a scalariform conjugation. What is the meaning of scalariform? Leather like. Clear? Likhibo eku nalage, just hetu janile ho gol, ha? A leather like kyo form korise because of the conjugating tube. Next is lateral. In case of lateral, as we have already said, only one filament is involved during this process. So ki hoy, we are talking about this filament, right? So what happens is, again the same explanation, any cell of the filament might act as a gamete. For example, A to Z gamete hisabe gutei contents kini globular hoy gol. What they will do is, so ultimately a pointing head form koribo, through which they will pierce through this septa and ultimately they will fuse with this. Is the point understood? Yate ki hobo, they will form the conjugating tube. Here what happens? Each and every cell can transfer itself into a zygote. Right? Prothomote to gamete form koribo, jodi fuse kore tera zygote form koribo. Ako etue yar logot ahibo pare. What they will do? Pyriform structure eta form koribo, pierce koribo, and then they will fuse it. This is all the information that you have to know. What is important is the two terms, scalariform conjugation and lateral conjugations. Kot dekha baba in case of Spirogyra. So this is all about green algae. Next part of the lesson, heading koriba brown algae. Brown algae portion of from examination point of view, what are the points that are important? First, the examples. Second, the life cycle of the examples. Third, the word diplontic, right? Haplontic life cycle and diplontic life cycle. Brown algae, diplontic life cycle. So, and the fourth word is the presence of a specific chemical compound that is called as phycocolloids, right? Specific phycocolloids are say in case of red algae, the name of the phycocolloid. In case of brown algae, you have to know the name of the phycocolloid. These are the points that are important. Brown algae, another point, always marine, right? Another point, seaweeds. Right? So, the words that are important I have already marked: seaweeds, marine, unicellular forms absent, exceptions are but the exceptions are not important. Then cell wall contains phycocolloids, important. Largest brown algae, macrocystis, will have certain words called as macrocystis, kelp, etc. Right. Menace to the shipping industry, mane gives a problem to the shipping industries. Keneke problem diye? Because they are free floating, ships bilakor tolot lagi jay, right, and it slows the movement of the ship. Remember the word kelps. Sargassum aru fucus. Next लिखा So thallus of brown algae has 3 parts, lamina, stipe and holdfast. Lamina, as the name suggests, the green part, the leafy part, the photosynthetic part. Stipe is the stalk-like structure. Inside the stipe you have certain tube-like structures that is called as a trumpet hyphae. Trumpet hyphae are analogous to the phloem of higher plants. Why is it called as such? Because both of them do the function of transporting food. Right? Phloem ki kore transports food, trumpet hyphae ki kore transports foods, right? And then we have the holdfast. Holdfast we know, non-green attachment. Trumpet hyphae पर questions ahi se, so he to sama. And while you are going through this chapter called as plant kingdom, all the diagrams that are given in your NCERT book, please look into. Okay, all the plants that are given, no? Ki ahibo pare, identify kora ahibo pare. Direct diagram to di dibo, and you have to identify the plant, right? So please look into the diagrams. Next, likha few examples of brown algae. Sargassamor pora Sargasso Sea. Have you heard this term? A sea is called a Sargasso Sea because that part of the water body is completely filled up with this type of a algae. So it is called as a Sargasso Sea. So question hai Sargasso Sea kuntu algae thake. We have to talk about the brown algae, that is Sargassum, right? Remember we have talked about a chart, comparative chart, no? Tar pora ami egita points porhilom. The cell wall, stored food. Stored food opor weird question ahe. What is the stored food of brown algae? But identify the stored food of green algae. Green algae to obviously starch hobo, right? And in case of brown algae, it will be laminated, yeah, or mannitol. Huh. So ekhini ami tar pora sam, we are not writing it down again. Why brown algae are brown in color? Brown algae pur brown kyo? Because obviously because of the presence of a particular type of pigment. No, if you are talking about brown algae, they are photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic. Photosynthetic. If they are photosynthetic, what is the pigment that you are going to find there? Chlorophyll to thakiboy. Apart from chlorophyll, keratinoids, right? Keratinoids has been divided in two parts, carotenes and xanthophylls, right? So hebilak to thakiboy tar uporiu a particular pigment that is called as fucoxanthin that gives brown in color. The amount of fucoxanthin is more as compared to the rest of the pigments, and so it appears brown, right? So if they have fucoxanthin, does that mean they will not have chlorophyll? They will have chlorophyll, right? They will have fucoxanthin, but fucoxanthin basic hai he karne. points or number 2? So, the name of the phycocolloids that is present in the cell wall of brown algae, specifically you have to name, and out of this 3 maximum question has been asked about fucinic acid and alginic acid. Question can fucinic acid is a characteristic of dash cell wall, brown algae cell wall, or question to ulta ke the phycocolloids of brown algae kiki, because we will have to talk about the phycocolloids of red algae also, they will have a different name. As far as the function of a phycocolloid is concerned, it gives protection against desiccation and shock. Shock is something that we understand. What is a shock? The unfavorable condition or ki hobo. They might have a tendency of having a shock, no? They might be shocked. And desiccation means drying off. That is what is called as desiccation. Was there anyone asking me something? laminarin, N-A-R-I-N, laminaria, laminaria. Special laminaria বুলি লিখিব পাৰা, laminarin, laminaria. So phycocolloids bilak, economic importance of phycocolloids because of the manufacture of certain things. It is used as a thickening agent, and plus they are also beneficial for the cell because they act as a protective measure to the cell, right. And what is important? The name of the phycocolloids, respective phycocolloids. So we know that cell wall will have cellulose, and apart from cellulose, one important component is the presence of phycocolloids. Next likha, economic importance of brown algae. So short form what likhi dium. Iodine আৰু এটা বস্তু লিখাছোন, out of this maximum question has been asked about this only. Iodine and bromine has been obtained from. So this is all about brown algae. So brown algae, the points that we have marked: kelps, largest algae, no unicellular forms available or found, generally marine. Next is we have to talk about the examples. Next, their plant body divided into 3 parts. Next, trumpet hyphae, and obviously phycocolloids, right. So take it up point. If this is over, next likhiba red algae. So red algae, if you talk about what are the points that you will remember, the first statement is red algae shares many similarities with blue-green algae, right. Second point, blue-green algae motile and non-motile? Non-motile. Red algae also non-motile, right. Third point, remember we have talked about a statement, all blue-green algae are not always blue-green in color. Similarly, the same statement, all red algae are not always red in color. We have certain exceptions, right. Next, again the phycocolloids that are present in case of red algae, the most common amongst them is agar-agar, right. Yaar jeneke ami alginic acid ba fusin ba fusidin egitar kotha poribo lage ba fucinic acid or kotha poribo lage, agar-agar to that specifically we have to talk about. Next is another word associated with something called as Godikoff's phenomenon. We have talked about Godikoff's phenomenon while we were studying about BGA and also in case of red algae. Godikoff's phenomenon ki koy, that they can change their color according to the depth of water where they are found. Surface of thakile belek color hobo, major thakile belek color hobo. If they are found depth or very beneath water or below the water, no, ekdom to the bottom of the water, titehale tahado color to change hobo. So this is what is called as Godikoff's phenomenon. So almost the same points as we have discussed in BGA. So red algae likha. As far as evolution is concerned, out of the 3 algae, most primitive kuntu, obviously red algae, and most advanced kuntu, green algae. So, where they are found? Generally in water bodies, but we have an example of a red algae that is found on land. Next, they are generally red in color, but we have an example of a blue colored red algae. So, caught pi, well lighted regions of to pi are low light, little light areas of to pi, right? And this statement obviously important, no motile stage. Talking about the cell wall, cellulose to থাকিবই, তার উপর pectin is a word that is important, বাকি কিটা ইমান important নহয়. Some of them will have calcium carbonate থাকিলে কি হব? Stony, right? The cell wall will appear stony in nature, especially we are talking about an example called as corallina that is found in the coral reef, right? ये two example है important. very important. Talking about reproduction, vegetative, asexual, sexual, what is so important? Non-motile word. Karon red algae logot sob non-motile word use hoy because they don't have any motility. So that's the important point. Sexual, when we talk about, they show oogamous type. Oogamous we have already discussed. Isogamous and isogamous are oogamous type. Oogamous type of sexual reproduction ki asil, the most advanced type of sexual reproduction. Second, sex organs are born within specific, gametes are born within specific sex organs. If you talk about isogamous or you talk about anisogamous, tat ki nasile, sex organs nasile, gametes were formed but sex organs were absent. But in case of oogamous, since it's the most advanced, you will see the gametes are formed within respective sex organs. Talking about sex organs, obviously the male sex organ and the female sex organ. Male sex organ, the normal name, no, enteridium. But in case of female sex organ, we will not be using the word archegonium because archegonium is absent in the group called as Algae. Because if we talk about the first archegoniads, it's always the bryophytes that are considered as the first archegoniads, right? So instead of archegonia, what they have is the structure called as carpogonium. Question ahibo pare, non-motile male gamete is seen in. So non-motile male gamete is seen in red algae, right? Not necessarily specifically NK ahibo je enteridium ki ase, spermatia ki hoy, heblakot nahe. The question is mainly concerned with non-motile. The red algae porhile non-motile is the first word they will study, right? Similar is in the case of blue-green algae also. Can I wrap this part? Okay. So edible red alga, porphyria, hetu ahibo important, but what is important is this one. Kodai a question to ahe, the agar agar is obtained from. Jeneke from brown algae, one very common question is iodine and bromine is obtained from, right? That is one important question, and from here that is Gelidium and Gracilaria. Give one example of a edible green algae. Edible green algae. Why this point is important? Because we are writing here what? Edible red algae. Because the most common example that we know is edible green algae. That example ki asile? I said it's the most common thing that we know, and now if you can't answer, kene ke hobo? Chlorella, space food, no. So that is the edible green algae. Hey to basic common karne generally question nahi, etu question no ahibo pare kintu. Specifically mention kori dibo edible red algae, right? Again, agar-agar phycocolloid or carrageenine phycocolloid, no, very important, obtained from, right? Next is, aru eta point likhi lao, then one point. See. So, three types of phycocolloids in case of red algae, agar-agar, carrageenine and pyrenoid, obtained from tar bhitor carrageenine aru agar-agar opor question ahise. Okay. Now coming to this point, it is obviously question to ahibo carrageenan is obtained from Condus crispus, you need to know. Next, the word Irish moss. Why is the word Irish moss important? Give an example of a moss which is not a moss. Generally when you talk about moss, moss belongs to which group of plants? Bryophytes. Kintu this is called as ki Irish moss. Etu bryophyte niki? No hoy. He karone tar upor question to ahibo. A moss that is not a moss that is not a bryophyte. Normally moss boli kole, so bryophytes are bitore hoy. Etu ki hoy? Algae hoy, right? So etu moss or upor specifically question ahe. What is Irish moss? Huh? Moss ki hoy because of its habitat, sciophytic type, nature, tenike pani lagibo, lower plant, right? So this is all about algae. We have completed algae today. In the next class, we will be talking about the next group, that is bryophytes. So algae jiman khini ami points tick korisu no, hekhini short note eta banai luba, right? And please go through the MCQs. You will have an idea se kenuka dhoroner questions ahise algae pura, right? Thank you.